so I'm just gonna start. Screw this. Okay, I'm pleased to introduce the best speaker of this conference, Matt Blaze. They didn't send to it, so I'm just doing it myself, without whom, nobody would have attended. All right, so first of all, this is the room for geolocation, and it's 3 o'clock no matter what your watch says, right? Okay, so we're running an hour late. Okay, so I'm pleased to introduce Matt Blaze, who's a wonderful human being. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And I want to thank Daniel Ellsberg and Ed Snowden for opening for me. This is like, yeah, I get to follow them, lucky me. Okay, so what I'd like to talk about for the next, let's call it 50 minutes, is the technology of tracking what we've come to call mobile devices. And in particular, this talk is going to be focused on law enforcement tracking via mobile devices, with more emphasis on what they actually do than on theoretically what they could do. And part of the reason for that is that the what they could do space is enormous, and there's virtually nothing one can do about it. But what they actually do is interesting, and it creates a kind of collision between needing to understand the technology and needing to understand the law and policy issues that are really subtle and interesting here. So, this is going to be very much focused on, in 2014, what are some of the open technological, legal, and policy questions related to tracking mobile devices, and how does it actually work? So first of all, when we say mobile devices, what are we talking about? So essentially, mobile devices, for our purposes here, are computers that have a couple of special features that make them particularly interesting from the point of view of tracking, and make them particularly important from the point of view of protecting or violating your privacy. The first property of a mobile device is that it's mobile. You carry it around with you, very often everywhere. And the mobile phone is sort of the classic example of this thing that we're really, people would sooner leave their house, without their keys or their pants than without their phones, right? These devices have lots of sensors crammed into them. They know a lot about what their environment is. In particular, these devices themselves generally know where they are. They generally have GPS units. They generally have directional sensors like compasses and so on. And they have the capability of transmitting signals to the outside world in a number of different ways. They have a cellular phone transmitter. They often will have cellular data services. They often have Wi-Fi. They often have Bluetooth, and they often have other things that you may or may not even be aware are existing. And then finally, mobile devices have this property that they, much more than the computers that we as hackers sort of grew up learning about, these are much more heavily tied to network-based services of various kinds provided by various places than other kinds of computing devices that we use. These devices are designed to be online, and not only are they designed to be online, they're designed to be online in multiple ways in order to function the way we expect them to function. Now, at one end of the spectrum, we have old-fashioned, dumb mobile phones that don't have touch screens, that you can't run apps on, and so on. And these have been kind of upgraded to include more computational capability, smartphones, tablets, and then there's this idea of the Internet of Things. Your car likely contains a number of mobile devices, very often that have been subscribed to with different services on your behalf when the car was built. and you may not have any direct relationship that you know about with the service provider that's providing them. And it's, driving around with you everywhere you go. Your toaster and your refrigerator and so on will soon be followed, although your refrigerator is a little less mobile than your car is. Right, unless it's running. Yes, very good. Okay, you get the worst joke of the conference award. Okay, so let's go to kind of some very oversimplified how phones work, kind of a baseline understanding the basic cellular technology. So basically, your phone handset, this device, is essentially a fairly low power, because its battery has to last a long time, and there are also, maybe health effects from zapping you with high levels of microwave radiation. So it's inherently a low power device that has a crappy antenna, making it effectively an even more low-powered two-way radio that you expect to have universal connectivity pretty much everywhere you go. So to make up for the fact that the range of your mobile phone is inherently very limited, it can only reach maybe a mile or so under even the most ideal circumstances, and in an urban area with lots of obstructions around it, considerably less than that. The cellular carrier has to build out a network of towers, which are called cell sites, that have essentially a connection to the back infrastructure, to the telephone network, to their network, such that there is a tower, a cell site, within range of your phone wherever you want to take it. And the term cellular phone, which is more commonly used in the US, in Europe they call them mobile phones, but the term cellular phones comes from the idea that you think of these ranges of the towers as cells that are adjacent to each other, tiled across a map. And you're in one particular cell at any time that has the best coverage of your phone. So essentially, a mobile phone company is primarily in the real estate business to rent these tower locations to put their cell sites in. And your handset is essentially looking for the cell tower that's broadcasting a signal, and you're also broadcasting a signal, and you figure out which of these cell sites is within range and which has the best signal coverage where you are at any given moment, and registers with that. Now, it has to do that in order to work. It has to do that even when you're not making a phone call, because that's the mechanism that your phone relies on in order to be able to receive calls. We have to know where you are in the network in order to know where to route an incoming call to you. So what this essentially says is that right off the bat, this device is at least doing some sort of coarse tracking of your location, because it has to in order to work that way. We know what cell you're in because that information has to be recorded with the cellular provider in order to route incoming calls to you. And as you move around, you're re-registering with different cells. And it's generally the one that's nearest you. And that essentially list of registrations identifies where you are within the radio range of your phone. So that's the sort of oversimplified version of this. How many people knew that already? Well, if I could see anything, I'd imagine everyone's raising their hand right now, right? But I can't see a thing, so I'm just going to pretend that everybody, that there are people in the room. I assume all of you have taken your clothes off or something. I just cannot see a thing up here. Okay. This is sort of the oversimplified version. So you might say, okay, well, I can live with that. Right? The radio range of my phone is maybe a mile, so that means I'm within a 1 mile radius of this. This thing can only track me within about a mile, right? Because that's, the cell companies, of course, want to economize. They're primarily in the real estate business. They want to economize on how many of these expensive towers they have to put up and all this expensive space that they have to rent. And they're going to want to get away with putting as few of those up as they possibly can. And what you might say is, well, we should put them up so that their distance is essentially the typical radio range of one of these phones, and that's a mile or two apart from each other. And so that's the limit of the resolution of the tracking that these kinds of devices do as you're registering with the network. But it turns out that now that everyone has one of these things, the radio range is not the limiting factor of how close or how far apart you can get away with having these. Because everybody wants one of these devices, and because the amount of radio spectrum allocated to cellular and mobile phone services is inherently a scarce resource. There's a limit to how much of it there is, and we're using more of it than there are users. And we're demanding more and more high bandwidth services to take up that limited amount of radio spectrum. The capacity of a cell tower is reached, particularly in any kind of populated area, well before the radio range radius would say you'd have to build another one. So you're going to reach all of the radio spectrum capacity for a cell tower within a much smaller, within all the users within a much smaller radius than you would if you were just looking at the radio range. And in fact, what that means is that how do you deal with this? Well, we could get more spectrum, but we've kind of reached the limit of that. They keep auctioning off more by trying to steal it away from television stations and public safety users. But we can't auction off spectrum fast enough to meet the demand. So what do you do? Well, what you have to do is have each of these towers serve fewer users. But everybody wants one. So how do you deal with this? Well, you put more towers in. You make the density of these cell sites closer and closer spaced together, so that instead of a 1 mile radius, it's going to have a small enough radius to be able to serve the users that are within range of this. So what effectively this means is that because everyone has one of these things, your location that's revealed by pairing with the nearest cell tower is going to be a much higher resolution, a much finer grained resolution than it was 20 years ago, when cell phones were this sort of luxury item that rich self-important people had. Now everyone is a rich self-important person. And what that means is that we're tracked as a sort of side effect of that. We're tracked with much more high resolution when we do this. How many of you have heard of the term microcell or nanocell or picocell? This is basically, these are cells that are getting smaller and smaller and cheaper and cheaper. Microcells are typically the term used for a cell site that's designed to serve a small public area, like this hotel, no doubt, has several microcells in it. Penn Station across the street has microcells in it that serve small areas within high-demand usage areas. Sometimes, a floor or part of a floor of a building will be served by this. Then there are these nanocells and picocells. They're not quite precisely defined, but these are cells that they basically convince you will give you better cell coverage in your house in exchange for being able to use some of your upstream broadband bandwidth to serve cell calls. So this is a little cheap device, and sometimes they even make you pay for it. A little cheap device that serves a really small area that you and possibly, depending on the policy of the service provider, will share with essentially the general public, that reveals that anybody who's paired with this particular small cell is really close to this, like in your house. Or very near your house. Okay, so the cellular infrastructure itself is starting to identify us in closer and closer ways, and that trend is only going to continue more and more and more and more, because the one thing we can grow essentially by manufacturing and deploying more of these things, is cell sites. We can't grow spectrum. We can't encourage people to use less bandwidth as we're building more high bandwidth services. Unless there's an apocalypse and people just stop using cell phones, we can kind of expect this trend to greatly accelerate. Okay, so let's look at what's in your phone. So there are a large number of radios and sensor devices in your phone. The most obvious is the cellular radio that communicates with the carrier that you get your service from, the AT&T or the T-Mobile or the Verizon. Usually you get a boo at this point when you mention them because nobody likes their cellular service provider, but they're all terrible. Your phone has a radio that's communicating with the nearby tower, and that's used for conventional voice telephone calls and also for whatever data service is carried over that, whether that's the old edge network or 3G or 4G or LTE or what have you. So we've already discussed how your phone is constantly announcing itself to the nearest infrastructure throughout the day. As you're using this, you're just kind of saying, hey, here I am, and they know who you are because you're sending them a check every month, or they're charging your credit card every month in all likelihood, unless you've gone out of your way to act like a criminal. All right, then there's a Wi-Fi radio in your phone. And what is the Wi-Fi doing? Well, it's trying to connect to the nearest hotspot, which may be in your home, the one for your home wireless network, or it may be some public infrastructure. But anytime the Wi-Fi radio is on, you're constantly announcing yourself to all of the nearby wireless base stations, no matter who happens to be providing them. So you're announcing yourself to basically anybody with a Wi-Fi router in the area. Now, most Wi-Fi routers are just kind of throwing this information out, but that doesn't mean you're not actually announcing it and they don't know. It's typically staying inside the routers that are listening to this in most places, maybe, unless somebody is trying to track who's nearby that way. And then there's the Bluetooth radio, which has a little bit of a smaller range than the typical Wi-Fi, but it's also announcing itself basically to every other Bluetooth device that's within range of it as it's being used and as you're moving around. And then finally, virtually every cell phone, whether it's exposed or not lately, has a GPS device in it. GPS uses satellites to calculate its own location. The good news here is that this is one the one radio in your phone that doesn't actually have a transmitter associated with it. This is essentially only calculating where your location is based on received signals from the satellite, where it does these little clever time difference of arrival calculations so that your phone can figure out where on Earth it is without having to actually explicitly go out and send a signal to anyone. This is one of the areas where the people with the tinfoil hats are wrong. The GPS satellites aren't the thing that's tracking you. There are other things that are tracking you. Okay. So let's look at now what your phone itself, what your handset, your mobile device knows about where it is on Earth. Well, one thing it knows is what cell tower it's registered with. As we discussed, the precision and accuracy of that depends on the density of the towers. You're typically registered with the nearest, and how fine the resolution of that is depends on how dense the area is, but it's getting denser and denser and denser. And in some cases, it's better than GPS, particularly when you're indoors where GPS doesn't work. Then there's a GPS calculation that it can do, and that's 3-meter accuracy with a bunch of asterisks next to it. The most important is that you have to be within view of a few satellites, typically 3 if you don't care about altitude, and that means usually you have to be outdoors or really near a window with the satellites in a good location. It also knows what Wi-Fi hotspots are nearby if you've got a phone with 802.11 capability in it. And that turns out to be a really interesting and powerful way of geolocating phones, because the hotspots, the base stations in Wi-Fi networks, the one in your house and the one in Starbucks and the one in the Hotel Pennsylvania, all are sending out unique identifying beacons of their own, and your phone can look at which hotspots, which routers it sees nearby, and say, oh, I'm near that one, and figure out what the location of that place is. Typically, it will ask for some help in order to figure out how to turn that onto a map. And then you can take kind of all of these different location tracking techniques and get a really surprisingly high resolution picture of where you are. If you, and I don't recommend you do this because they'll know, but if you wanted to take your Android or iPhone or whatever and put up the Google or Apple Maps, well, Apple Maps will be inaccurate because they think that I think we're in Boston or something, but if you put up like Google Maps on your phone, you're inside a room. It can show you where in the building you are with a pretty high, it kind of knows you're in this room because there's a unique hotspot in this room that you can identify with. And I actually tried this in this room the other night and got a little bit freaked out about this. So let's look at what others can learn about where you are. Well, we already discussed how the cellular carrier knows which cell sites you're registered with throughout the day, even when you're not making a call, because it has to keep track of this information in order to know how to route calls for you. As long as your phone is on and the cellular radio is on, you're not in airplane mode, this is constantly registering with these locations, and so the cell phone company is in a position to track that. Now, your Wi-Fi and Bluetooth radios are constantly announcing their MAC address to anybody within range, and this address is typically not something that most users ever change. So it's essentially a persistent identifier for your phone unless you've taken some steps to change it from time to time. Now, using Wi-Fi-based location services further reveals your location to whatever platform provider, like Google or Apple, is using that to help locate you using Wi-Fi. You know what the identity, you know what the MAC address of the nearest hotspots are, but what you don't know is where on earth they are. Well, they've driven around and mapped that out conveniently for you, and if you simply tell it which ones you're in range of, which the phones are essentially programmed to do periodically, they will happily tell you what your map coordinates are, and so that you can display your location. But of course, in the process, you have told them, your phone software has told them where you're located. So Google and Apple and so on, when your Wi-Fi radio is on and you're using location services, know where you are. They're also typically combining that with information from the cell radio about what towers you're near, so that when you go out of range of a hotspot, you still have that as a fallback. So what do we have now? Well, now we have everybody with a Wi-Fi router, everybody with a Bluetooth device who you get near, your cellular provider, and Google or Apple or whoever is your platform provider of your phone is getting helpful constant updates about what your movements are just by virtue of having your phone be on with its data services on. Now, if you connect over the internet, of course, you get assigned an IP address either by the Wi-Fi hotspot or by your cellular data service, and that IP address can be mapped back to location information, typically by whoever you happen to connect to on the other end. Possibly they'll need some cooperation from a provider to get it, but that information is now, is now something that exists and can be obtained. And then, of course, you have the application economy on mobile devices, which, as best as I can tell, is based on the whole ecosystem is based on getting you to install apps with dancing frogs on them in exchange for trying to steal as much of your personal information as possible. And they're leaking information back to, Angry Birds headquarters, constantly throughout the day. Sorry? Not. there's a flashlight app that steals your location. And if you turn off, do you want us to steal your location? You can switch that to off, and then it turns out they were doing it anyway. So you can't even trust your flashlight. Okay, so let's ask, what about the government? So there are a few questions to ask when we think about, well, how much government and law enforcement tracking is going on here? And the first thing that we have to do is distinguish between intelligence agency data collection and law enforcement data collection. And that's going to turn out to be an important distinction. We're learning a lot about what intelligence agencies are doing, thanks to that guy who opened for me earlier. But that's not really our focus here. One question is wholesale versus targeted. What are they getting about everyone versus what do they have to ask specifically about a target in order to get? We might also distinguish between things that are real-time versus things that can only be done for the target in the future after they've been identified in the target versus things that can be done looking back in the past about where a target has been. We might look at call metadata as something that might be tracked versus location data that might be tracked versus actual content of communication that might be tracked. That might be a way to divide up how intrusive different things are. We might look at what can be done unilaterally by a government agency versus what requires the cooperation of a third party, such as a cellular carrier. And we might look at the legal standards that govern them before they can do this, which it turns out range from someone is curious to a subpoena is issued based on some standard, such as relevance to an investigation, versus what everyone kind of grew up thinking is the standard for getting this sort of information, which is a probable cause warrant. Okay, so let's spend a couple of minutes looking at what intelligence agencies do. So Snowden has told us some stuff here. The first was the 215 program, which was interesting. All call detail records in phone companies, basically the records of all phone calls made by just about all the phone companies with a couple of little exceptions, were required to deliver daily to the US government, the FBI heading on their way to the NSA, for everybody. So if you were a phone subscriber in the US, all of your call detail records were essentially sent to the FBI and the NSA from sometime shortly after September 11th, 2001 through the present and beyond. And this may or may not include location information, the tower, the cell site that you're in. It's unclear whether these records with location information were delivered. It appears to be variable based on the particular phone company's interpretation of what they were supposed to send, but there really hasn't been solid information about whether it's universally supposed to be there. The government has explicitly denied that they get the location, but then if you look at the words, they're subject to an enormous amount of incredibly careful parsing, surprisingly so. Then there's the cable tapping program that we learned about actually before Snowden, when an EFF, a whistleblower literally walked into the EFF office and said, look, there's this secret room in the San Francisco central office where the NSA is tapping all the fiber optic cables. And when they looked to find out that no one was missing from any of the local mental institutions, it turned out he was right. And now that turns out to happen at just about all of the cable landings. Or near all of the cable landings, but so it's supposedly focused on international traffic, but it seems to pick up some domestic US traffic. And that basically exposes not just call metadata, but also potentially content of anything that happens to go through those particular locations. We learned something about handset malware implants, which is a kind of scary sounding term. That can load malware into your phone in order to put it under the control of a government agency. One particularly interesting thing that a piece of malware like this might do is affect what the off switch does. and if you're targeted. Chances are this is only being done on some kind of targeted basis. It doesn't appear to be done on every phone, but they certainly have very, very sophisticated capabilities along these lines.
Are you now on the target list?
Who knows? Anybody want a phone? Maybe we should trade. It looks like there's some leakage from what the intelligence agencies are doing into domestic law enforcement, which I'll talk about later, but mostly these seem to be limited to intelligence rather than being used for traditional domestic U.S. law enforcement investigations, with a couple of exceptions that we'll get to later. Okay, so let's get to where we really want to focus on this. So law enforcement is a little more constrained. I'm calling that LE in order to save a few syllables and also to add some unnecessary acronyms here. Law enforcement has limited budgets relative to the intelligence community. It's most overwhelmingly state and local rather than federal. And they also need to collect legally admissible evidence in court, which means they may have to ask questions about how that evidence was obtained. And again, there's some evidence that they do get some information from the federal government, in particular the DEA's Hemisphere program, but that seems to be the exception rather than the rule. Mostly, law enforcement is doing relatively small scale and relatively in different ways targeted technologies for tracking mobile devices. They have things like looking at call detail records, doing something called a pen register and trap and trace, getting content wiretaps, which is sort of what we think of when we think of wiretaps, E911 services, which I'll get to in a second, something called a tower dump, which sounds very unpleasant, and devices like Stingrays, which are also called MSI catchers. And then finally, they occasionally seem to have the increasing capability to target handsets with malware. So let's look at some of these more targeted techniques. Every time you make or receive a phone call, the carrier creates a billing record associated with that call called a call detail record. And essentially, a call detail record is a record associated with your phone account that gives the number you called or that called you, the duration of the call, the time that the call happened, and which cell site you were registered with. So essentially, this is a record of your location when you placed the call, and depending on the carrier, maybe when the call ended and maybe throughout the call as you roam, but certainly when the call is initiated. And these records are a subset of the records of the information that the phone company has. They know where you are even when you're not making or receiving a call, but they create this special kind of record called a call detail record anytime your phone gets used. And these are maintained for a while. 18 months is the legal minimum that they have to maintain this for. And really what that means is, this is data. Data is free to save. It's more expensive to throw out than to save. And I think it's safe to say that everybody keeps them forever. These are useful for business reasons for the phone companies. But because it's an official record, it's straightforward legally for law enforcement to make use of call detail records for targets. So a law enforcement agency can request of a carrier the call detail records for some period of time for some user who is of interest to an investigation. And the standard for obtaining this, and I'm not a lawyer, but I'm not going to let that stop me from making stuff up about the law. The standard for this is relevance to an investigation. And that's a very low standard, but it requires that you as a target be specifically identified as being relevant to an investigation. And essentially, they take the agents and the agency's word for whether you are, but they have to basically declare this. Now, it's unclear whether the call detail records given in response to this kind of request will include location information. This appears to be unsettled law. Different courts have different practices. Different law enforcement agencies interpret this differently. In some cases they do, and in some cases they don't, based on this sort of relevance to an investigation standard. They may only get the calling numbers and the times, or they may get the location information. And this is an opportunity for Congress or the courts to give us some clarity on this that it does not yet exist. Okay, now generally, the records are specifically the official call detail records. When a law enforcement agency asks for call detail records, they don't get the list of the cell sites you were at when you weren't making or receiving a call, even though the phone companies have that information. And it may be that the reason that they don't get those records is they haven't figured out how to properly ask for them yet. But the typical practice is to get the call detail records. Now let's look at what this is. This is a record that they have that retrospectively can be obtained by anyone for their calls in the past, whether you were whether they knew you were a target at the time you made those calls or not. Everybody has call detail records on them, and these can be requested within 18 months or possibly more for anyone who becomes relevant to an investigation. So this can look back in the past at what your previous activity was. If we want to go into the future, there's something called a pen register or trap and trace. These terms are based on old-timey telephony technology. Essentially, this is like a call detail record, but real-time and perspective going forward. They get real-time, the law enforcement agency gets real-time delivery of all of the calls you make or receive, possibly again with your location, but this is unsettled law, with each call that you make. And there's a standard interface that the phone companies have called the CALIA interfaces for delivering this to law enforcement agencies in real time once it's set up and provisioned. Now this is more expensive than a call detail records request because it involves this real-time delivery, so they're used a little bit less, but the legal standard is very similar to getting past records. This is a wiretap box. This is a single-line wiretap box, just to kind of give you what it looks like. And this can be used for collecting call detail records or doing what we call a full-blown Title III wiretap, where they're also getting the call content. Again, the same interface is used as for trap and trace, but it's provisioned differently to include call content audio when you do this. And when they get one of those, they're also definitely getting cellular location when you're using a cell phone delivered along with this. This has a high legal standard to get. It's essentially requires a probable cause warrant plus a couple of additional hurdles. They have to demonstrate or at least assert that other investigative techniques would not get the evidence that they're seeking in order to do this. This is a fairly high standard, and it's also an expensive process. You'll notice there's a big red button on the front of the box. Someone has to actually be sitting there listening to the calls in real time and be ready to push the big red button marked minimize when something non-pertinent happens. And so this means that wiretaps not only have a higher legal standard when they have call content audio, they also are a little more expensive to implement. Then there's something called E911 pinging. The FCC mandated about 20 years ago, and it's been rolled out pretty completely within the last 10 years, a service called E911 that mandates that when you call 911, the 911 call center can get with very high accuracy the location of the handset, so that when you call and say, help, help, I'm in a room full of people and the lights are out, they will know where you're located. This uses a variety of technologies, including handset-based GPS, which is why just about every phone has a GPS unit in it, and also tower triangulation with multiple nearby towers and time difference of arrival. Essentially, there's some cooperation with the handset through a standard interface to implement this. But interestingly, it doesn't actually require a 911 call in order to be triggered. The carrier can trigger this essentially for any phone at any time, including at law enforcement requests. There's a service that they will provide to law enforcement where they will say, ping us, Matt's phone and tell us what the E911 data is on that. All right, now what we've looked at so far were kind of standard wiretapping techniques, which should, make you think, all right, I'm being tracked everywhere I go, but you might say, if I'm not actually a suspect in a crime or relevant to an investigation, as long as I stay out of trouble, I'm okay here. Because I have to be targeted. I have to be identified as a target. And that's an important safeguard for kind of all of the things that we've just discussed. But it turns out there are also techniques that don't get targeted based on the identity of the subscriber, but that are targeted based on where your phone happens to be. The most prominent of these that we've learned about recently is something called a tower dump. This is a standard service to law enforcement agencies. We know about it thanks to a 2011 ACLU public records request. It wasn't really widely known before. It's still not that widely known even to all law enforcement agencies that they can get this. Thanks particularly to Tucson, Arizona, they had really great records about what the prices are from the different carriers and how cooperative the different carriers are. So the ACLU asked Tucson to send these records, and they did. Essentially what this does is allows law enforcement to request every cell phone that registered with a particular tower during a particular time interval. So if they want to know what phones were near this thing that was going on at some time, to use a kind of non-controversial example, the Boston bombing, right? They could get a tower dump of all the cell towers nearby and identify what cell phones were in the area. Now this is inherently untargeted by subscriber because it's targeted by location. If you happen to register with this tower, you're included in that record, you'll be included in a tower dump for any time period where you registered with the tower. What's the legal standard to get a tower dump? Who knows? Okay, then there's a way for law enforcement to do this themselves using a technique usually referred to by the product name Stingray, made by Harris. This is not a product placement. They didn't pay me to mention them, but here's what one looks like, this beautiful Stingray device. This is a portable device that basically pretends to be a cell site. And what it does is says, I'm a cell site, I've got a really great signal, everybody register with me. And then everybody does. Your phone kind of automatically does that. Now this is typically not connected to any backhaul, so as soon as it collects the identities of all of the handsets in the area, it says, oh, I'm not a cell site, and lets you go back to using the regular cell sites, because it can't actually complete calls for you typically. But this is usually used early in an investigation to identify what the target's phone number is, but anybody in the area will register with this cell site if they're within radio range in it. Again, unclear what the legal standard is. It's a kind of bulky thing. Okay, now, there's some trickle-down effect. We've basically have looked at the technology law enforcement is using in 2014, which was no doubt similar to the technology that intelligence agencies were using in, say, 1994. There's a kind of trickle-down effect that the really good surveillance technology gets invented for intelligence and then makes its way down to local, state and local law enforcement as Moore's law makes it cheaper and easier to use. So what the NSA is doing today, what Snowden is telling us about this week, Tomorrow the Tucson Police Department is going to have lots of that stuff. Stingrays are going to get smaller and cheaper. Data collection is going to get more and more ubiquitous. Malware to install in handsets is going to get more and more commoditized for law enforcement agencies. And we've already seen this with the Drug Enforcement Agency, which partnered, I love that term, with AT&T, where AT&T basically said, oh, let me give you all of our call detail records with the location, because you can use that for your law enforcement mission, and thanks for paying us to do it for some period of time. So they were getting sort of bulk call detail record, similar to the 215 program for a period of time over the last decade. And that gave rise to this frightening term called parallel construction, where they deliberately would then recreate the same evidence, not using the hemispheres data when they actually brought a criminal prosecution, to avoid this coming out in court. So, we don't really know what all of the law enforcement intelligence cooperation is, because they're getting better and better at this parallel construction technique. Okay, so what can we do about this? As we're hackers, right? We should be able to help ourselves, and at least if everybody else is being spied upon, we can avoid being spied upon ourselves, right? Well, we have great technology for protecting content. Crypto is a really great way to prevent eavesdroppers from understanding what your communication is. But we have really less great technology for protecting metadata. Snowden gave me a great line, which is, he said, grad students of the world, this is the problem you should be working on. And he stole that line from me, apparently, because I was going to say that. This is just a great area to be doing research in, because it's a wide open field. Now you might say, what about Tor? Well, Tor is great. It prevents the observer from learning who you're communicating with, whether it's your endpoint itself or somebody observing what's going on the network. But what it doesn't do is prevent a carrier from learning how you, the subscriber to that carrier, accessed their network, which you might notice was how all of this mobile device tracking works. So Tor solves a number of very important problems, but it doesn't solve this problem. And in fact, we kind of don't know how to solve this. So what I would suggest is we learn as much as we can from the wire. Burner phones. So what's a burner phone? Well, it's an anonymous cell phone account, typically paid for in cash, maybe with a ski mask over your head as you're doing it. You change your burner phones frequently, and that's inconvenient, but then there's the hard part, which is that you use your burner phone only to communicate with a new network of burner phones and never link that back to the communications network that you communicated with in the past, or your own number. Don't take your burner phone home and immediately test it by calling your other cell phone, right? Which is virtually impossible to not do. In fact, don't ever turn it on in your home. So this is kind of hard to do, but it does give rise to an important technique, which is try to change your identity to the network frequently. You can change your Wi-Fi and sometimes Bluetooth MAC addresses frequently, and that can be a way of doing this. But mostly, these are baby steps, and we really have to look at good systematic tools for doing this that give us some sort of assurance. We have time for 50% of a question. Okay, does anybody have a question? And I can't see you. So.
Question about cryptophones. Just this last thing you were talking about with voice, that crypto doesn't really work. This is going back like 8 years, but there was a company in Germany, cryptophone.org, they were talking about encrypting the voice call over the data channel. How come that hasn't become more ubiquitous?
Well, finally that technology is getting to some fruition, but it still doesn't help you with the fundamental problem, which is that once your handset has been identified as the thing to track, as it moves around the network, even if it's a crypto phone, it can still be tracked in the same ways. We basically don't know how to do that. So thanks a lot, everyone, and I think we're done.
There's a VGA drop somewhere here. And you can measure the lightning.
Good evening, all. Couple of quick announcements to make before we start the next presentation. We have concerts tonight, electronic music concerts, chiptunes, starting downstairs by the escalator to the mezzanine at 10 p.m. And if you were there last night, you know how unbelievable it was. If you weren't there, you missed out, and this is your chance to make up for it. So check those out. Lightning talks are starting right now in the U room. If you're interested in those, go check that out. As you all know, the previous keynotes went long, so everything scheduled for today is pushed forward an hour. So right now you're seeing the talk that was scheduled on the grid an hour ago. Also, as a result, the how to install Linux on your time machine talk has been pushed forward to 3 p.m. yesterday. Hold up. So beyond all that, we, without further ado, will announce the, what's your announcement?
We're having a magic tournament at midnight.
Where is it? Okay. There's a Magic the Gathering tournament tonight at midnight at the mezzanine. If you're into that, check that out. It's a draft, so you don't need to bring anything. Magic the Gathering.
Magic?
Yes, it's a card game. That dude right there will tell you all about it. Okay, beyond all that, we're about ready to go. So it's my pleasure to announce Project PM, crowdsourcing research of the cyber intelligence complex. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up.
Hey everyone, thanks for coming. My name is Kevin Gallagher. I also run the Barrett Brown Legal Defense Fund, and Barrett Brown's the person who originally created this thing called Project PM. When he had this idea called Project PM, originally in like 2009, what he was seeing was the failure of the media, and he was looking for ways to improve it. And he was really upset with like mainstream pundits like Thomas Friedman and Charles Krauthammer, who don't know what they're talking about most of the time. But you know, and also Barrett, as a skeptic, is interested in a scientific form of journalism. And so at the beginning, it was all very theoretical, but you know, on the occasion of the Arab Spring and the activity with Anonymous being involved in Optinesia and the hack of H.B. Gary, it kind of completely evolved into this whole new thing where he created this wiki site, and he's soliciting volunteers to go through, you know, open source intelligence, things that are available in the public domain, and also, you know, emails that have been hacked by Anonymous out of security firms. Try to figure out what they're up to and see what is in there that may be of journalistic import. So, I mean, with that, so everyone knows how a wiki works. It's just media wiki software that anybody can post and edit to and collaborate on. And so the express purpose of Project PM here is to provide a centralized, actionable data set regarding the intelligence contracting industry, the PR industry's interface with totalitarian regimes, the mushrooming InfoSec/cybersecurity industry, and other issues constituting threats to human rights, civic transparency, individual privacy, and the health of democratic institutions. I think that's the angle that with which all of us are approaching the subject today. But this all might seem very innocuous and innocent and very First Amendment protected, like research activity that anyone might do. But so actually, the FBI served a search warrant on him in March 2012, and right down there on number 8, they listed the actual URL of the wiki, which they were seeking records for. Yeah. Somehow they're interested in this wiki that's exposing the, you know, surveillance complex and the private contractors who work in collusion with the government. And a year after that, you have a subpoena that's served to Cloudflare to get all the information behind the domain that's hosting this wiki. So clearly it's viewed as some kind of threat to the government. The fact that journalists and researchers and volunteers who were involved in this were putting together this information in one place. Well, before I introduce the slide, I like to introduce it by saying this is the face of evil, but I don't mean any offense to any people who may work for any of these companies. But this is what we're talking about, is this massive
Excuse me,
industry.
Kevin. I'm sorry.
What's
but
that?
as long as you're going to be talking about the slides, could someone see if we can get the projector working so the people in the crowd can see the slides?
Oh, are we going with no slides at all?
Unless they can fix the projector really quickly, which I believe they can, correct?
Hack it.
Yeah, I was completely talking based on my slides.
Let's get that fixed really quickly. We can talk faster.
Please.
Or if like everyone can come up and just gather around us. we could-
Here comes the. There's a cavalry out there, and they're coming to fix the projector. I can
This
hear
is
them.
rather essential to our talk.
Is there like a good hashtag we can use to get like
Help tech support.
Yeah.
That might make it more interesting. We can interrogate them.
Is there anyone with AV or support in the room?
Cool.
I think we can.
Do we need it?
I apologize for the technical inconvenience. We'll see. We'll see.
Is
if
there a
someone's coming.
volunteer, a Hope volunteer in the audience? Just yell out yes. Okay, can you go find whomever? Find the person with the most power to make this happen as quickly as possible.
Oh yeah.
We got something?
We could solve it ourselves, self-governance.
Do we need it?
Put the slides online on the wiki or
Can you put the PDF on the
something? Needs to be
Well,
Bluetooth it or
I
something?
had been told that this was tested and working.
I think it's that. That's the projector, right? Yeah. Help is coming, the cavalry. Can you hear them? I can hear them.
What a disaster! All right, we're gonna start over.
Well, that actually
We're
fits into
starting
the
over, yeah.
crowdsourcing paradigm that things can get kind of messy when you have a bunch of citizen journalists rocking the town, rocking the intelligence agencies and everything. Sometimes it's not as pretty clean as, the more swank outfits.
You got this? Alright. Well, can we just just talk about shit, rather than us just waiting?
Yeah. See. Detecting it.
Yeah. No.
This looks like progress. Plug it in now. Right.
This would be so disappointing if like it was actually a good slideshow.
Which it is.
Maybe your part, like.
So I think in the meantime, perhaps Joe, do you have any
Yeah.
stuff?
Well, while we finish this up, one of the big things that Barrett found during Arab Spring was that a lot of these tech firms were helping out dictators in the Middle East monitor all of their citizens under total surveillance.
And you were watching this from your front row seat, right?
Well, this was like, I'm just like sitting at home and just knowing what these firms are up to, and like seeing that they could just scrape up every GPS coordinate of everybody in the Middle East who has a Facebook profile, and where they could just go target, arrest, beat, torture. They did this in Egypt. They did this in Syria. They're doing this right now in Gaza as we speak. And this is what we figured out. And it's been a trip, and it's harrowing. It's really like to see this happening, to see people like Zuckerberg and like other people and like tech giants who just really don't give a fuck about people's privacy and safety.
Keep going, Joe.
Just it's really harrowing, I think, and it's like we see so much of what's happened in the Middle East, I feel like could have been prevented if we weren't selling stuff to these regimes. We weren't just giving them like 0 days backdoors and just handing people's entire lives on a silver platter.
And you saw that with IRC channels, right? Like in IRC?
This is just generally like on Twitter and just at Facebook and like literally just like compiling research from every single corner of the web and just noticing these little things.
And then connecting the information to the right people, so the crowdsourcing happens and funnels it up to people who get it to a wider audience.
The best way to do it, we were just blasting stuff out on Twitter, and everybody else was seeing it happen at the same time. Everybody was coming to a consensus. Our little bubble of hacker people, and we try to tell this to people that aren't really as technologically savvy, and they're just like, huh,
Yeah. All right. To start off from where I lost video, Barrett's really unique innovation was to recognize the power of the internet for collaboration and the fact that there were thousands upon thousands of these emails and no one knows what's in them. So yeah, let's solicit people to go through them. Yeah, this is a picture of the wiki. I told you what its stated purpose was. And this is the search warrant that was served by the FBI against his residence in his mom's house. Explicitly names the URL of that wiki. A year later, they also served the subpoena to Cloudflare, trying to figure out who was running the domain. If they had followed that up with multiple subpoenas, they could have figured out more potentially, like who is actually editing and contributing to it. And this is the axis of evil, I suppose. We're here to talk about firms like Palantir, HB Gary, Stratfor, Booz Allen Hamilton, Raytheon, Mantech, Gamma, Endgame Systems, Cubic. This is the privatized side of the surveillance apparatus that does not get as much discussion as like the NSA does, but yet it constitutes over 70% of the U.S. intelligence budget. It's going, so at least 70%. Yeah, of the U.S. intelligence budget is going to contractors. There's very little accountability for it all.
You can't send them Freedom of Information Act requests, for example.
Yeah, like the NSA, all those crazy acronym government agencies. They're doing a lot of crazy stuff. We all know that, but they're not necessarily doing all of it. They're going to the private sector, and random dudes in Northern Virginia are going to work and going to these companies and doing jobs as a proxy for Uncle Sam, and there's not the same kind of oversight. So
they don't have PR spokespeople that you can call, at least not that'll definitely answer the phone and give you something at least.
Do not sound like idiots.
Yeah. And these guys have a profit motive too.
Right.
More over than anything. So when the whole industry is just mushrooming, it's like, how much stuff could you guys possibly vacuum up and then put into your little tables and convert, and what are you guys getting out of all of this? What are you doing with all of our taxpayer money?
I'm not a fan of the U.S. government, but the fact is that the intelligence community research was meant to benefit the public good, and now it's being run by the profit motive. So how does the profit motive and the public good mix? It doesn't.
Yeah, so here are some examples of stories that, captivated Project PM's attention. This first one is an exclusive report that was filed by Project PM and Barrett Brown. Within the HB Gary emails, he had discovered a program called Romas Coin, and it was due to be replaced with a program called Odyssey. It basically entailed mass surveillance against the Arab world, leveraging sophisticated mobile phone software and a lot of things we don't understand, like linguistics and semantics and stuff like that. They were looking for people that are experts in these things. And obviously, some of you may be familiar with the Team Themis scandal, another thing that came out of this where people were hired to go after opponents of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and in particular, WikiLeaks and Glenn Greenwald. A whole consortium of these firms, basically Palantir, Barrico, HB Gary, were among them. They were formulating this plan to, you see it here, feed disinformation, create messages to sabotage or discredit the opposing organization, submit fake documents, and then call out the error. This was all being discussed, and if this is
Those were tactics to WikiLeaks.
right, these are tactics that they were considering to deploy against WikiLeaks.
None of that's defensive either. That's all offensive tactics. Like, it's not. Yeah.
Between the offensive
Yeah.
and the defensive here is what are they trying to block these off of all computer networks? Are they trying to figure out who's reading all of these cables, who's gaining this knowledge, who in the government shouldn't be reading it? Like there's so many programs going on. Our government and our congressmen can't even possibly keep track of any of them, let alone if they, actually gave a shit.
Can everybody
Yeah.
hear in the back? Okay, speak closer to the microphones, everyone.
So here's another one. Back in 2012, this DoD information operations contractor called Leone Industries was basically caught in a smear campaign against a group of journalists at USA Today who had written critically of that same firm, and they had to apologize. But yeah, this is the type of stuff that goes on. And I think activists and journalists are, of course, the prime targets for these firms.
Project PM research fed into these articles that.
That's absolutely correct, yeah. This is another thing. U.S. government software creates fake people to spread messages via social networking. This is a thing called persona management that entails the ability for one intelligence analyst to control multiple fake sock puppets that are basically indistinguishable from regular people, or at least the average person wouldn't be able to tell because it's replete with like background and history and fake friends, and they're using these things to spread disinformation, to gather information on a target, to discredit people and do things like that. Similarly, there's a lot of monitoring of social media going on by the private sector. Raytheon's Riot program is one example. This was reported by Ryan Gallagher in The Guardian. There's a company called Bright Planet. They advertise this this program called Blue Jay. It bills itself as a law enforcement Twitter
Star Wars.
Did you just get blasted?
Just keep going.
Yeah, all these things are marketed to law enforcement, and so this is a law enforcement Twitter crime scanner, and they're going to be scanning Twitter and collecting massive data sets to try to predict suspicious behavior and when a crime might happen.
And these slides you're seeing are Project PM research that fed up to wider audiences with the mainstream media.
Another example is Intrepid has a thing called Tartan. It boasts the ability to identify ranks of influence within human networks and uncover hidden or missing relationships. What that basically means is it can de-anonymize people. You point this software at a group of people, applications listed, national security, federal law enforcement, and so on. In their brochures for this, they explicitly mentioned Occupy Wall Street as a target. And as Joe mentioned, and another one of the huge issues with this is that the firms in the West have no qualms about selling these things to authoritarian or regimes or dictatorships in third world countries. And that's what happened is this firm, Amisys, sold spyware that was used by Gaddafi, spyware which allowed them to, probably detain, kill people.
More than just spyware and hacking, just a fully diversified machine of public relations to just say the same bullshit line over and over again. We found this with the firm called Corvus in Bahrain, while they have a very large PR contract to basically just write articles for like PR Newswire to say, hey guys, like the regime, the royalty is making baby steps to reform all the time. And they've had this uprising going on for the past 4 years. And we don't even pay attention to it. Our government really just is kind of shoot it off because we have military base there. The 5th Fleet is based out of there. And only recently, I think, the other day when our one of our top diplomats went over there and they got kicked out of the country for meeting with opposition leaders. So it's like, at what point are you guys going to keep continuing this madness?
So I just have a few more slides, and I'm going to turn it over to the rest of our panel. I'm going to introduce each of these people. Finn Fisher, Gamma International. This program was discovered being used against Egyptian activists and journalists. It's a total, it's a RAT, which is a remote access program that allows total control over the target's computer. This is just a screenshot of Palantir's software that they can map out networks and basically identify foci of influence. And another issue that is significant for Project PM is the subject of zero-day exploits, and no one's really figured out what the solution is as far as regulating this. I mean, I know there is a campaign to a coalition against the unlawful surveillance exports, because most of the surveillance tech is developed in the West, and then it's used for repression and oppression in other countries. So with that, I think, is it Joe?
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
I'll start off. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit.
Be sure to talk into the mic, really close to it. Volume's low.
Testing. All right. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit towards the end of Jeremy Hammond's trial. Or not even trial, just discovery phase. Hey, let's keep him in a hole for 18 months while we try to, the government's trying to avoid having to tell everybody that there was an original hacker of Stratfor that zero-dayed his way into their entire database email server and gave this exploit to Cebu. We had this, the government had to admit this in a filing that this actually happened, and then he, in turn, gave the exploit to Jeremy. So they were working in tandem, essentially, without...
Cebu was an FBI informant hacker.
For anybody that doesn't, has been living under a rock here with lulsec, so without the FBI informant's help, there's no, they probably wouldn't even have been hacked in the first place. Interestingly enough, Stratfor is involved with Mantech they had a contract for irregular warfare services and to conceptualize for the military how they would do these operations abroad. And they were just, they haven't really said what they were doing with it, but irregular warfare is basically your non-kinetic firing weapons at each other. It's maybe more like subversion, maybe I don't know, sending hookers to a politician you want to take down or something like that. It could encompass a lot of things, that it's been around since as long as humans have been beating the shit out of each other.
What about the
anyway,
acquisition of HB Gary by Mantech?
That was also very curious too. Mantech acquires HB Gary, and they're able to go and say hey, we're not responsible. We're buying your company, but we're not buying your responsibilities for all the stuff that you might have been on the hook for. Going even further back, Cebu was involved in hacking Mantech and looting and pillaging. I think that was what Fuck FBI Friday 1 or 2 was one of those. So FBI is involved. Basically, we caught them hacking themselves. I had to suspend disbelief. I thought I had been seeing this for months and years on end, and then finally it's seemed like a pretty legit hypothesis. I didn't want to. I felt like I was a conspiracy theorist, and finally it's well,
it's been confirmed. Yeah.
So then I have to ask myself, why did they allow this to happen? Was this incompetence, or did they really want to take Stratfor down a peg? Reading a lot of the Stratfor emails, I maybe think the latter. There's a lot of...
The most plausible.
There's a lot of stuff that Stratfor's doing and have their hands in that I would probably say that that's likely as well. They had a hedge fund. They were starting a hedge fund called StratCap that was events futures trading. So it was another version of InTrade. So they would basically have this computer that would trade on algorithms, and while they're doing this other irregular warfare thing, there's just all of these other things that Stratfor is doing that would combine into their one missions. So
They were setting up StratCap with a Goldman Sachs guy, so it's no small fry.
right. So
So next we're gonna have Andrew Blake. He's a reporter with RT. He's covered many of these things. I have your slides here.
Hello. Thanks. So yeah, hi. My role here, I was kind of in a really particular place when Project PM was doing a lot of really important stuff. And to go back, one thing in particular that we found out was this thing called trapwire. But to back up a little bit, like if you're not following, or if you weren't following the whole thing that actually happened with these Stratfor emails, was Stratfor is another one of these is the geopolitical consulting, like, yeah, jerks. Yeah, private CIA, and so they were hacked by, as Joe was saying, by the FBI actually. But it's anyway. So
It's true.
Basically, an FBI informant steering Jeremy Hammond, who had the technical expertise.
and this isn't like setting up a fake bomb for somebody to go be raided later. This is like hacking's real.
Yeah, so if you go back 2.5 years ago to late 2012, Stratfor was hacked by the FBI and anonymous, and a couple thousands of emails were pilfered.
5 million.
5 million. Okay, thank you. And eventually, those actually got published by WikiLeaks, and you can go on WikiLeaks and you can read these millions of emails sent from people within Stratfor, the vice presidents, and they're all like old CIA cronies, like, and some of them still affiliated, obviously, kind of that culture, like, exists there. So you start going through these emails and you start just catching keywords. WikiLeaks actually, after a while, built a great search function, and you can go to I think gifiles.wikileaks.org and type in whatever.
Type in raghead.
Oh, yeah.
Anybody wants to go.
The vice
see
president of
some-
intelligence at Stratfor, Fred Burton, is notorious for racial slurs.
Yeah. So one of the things that we found one day was this thing called trapwire, and it was reported for a little while in the press a few months after Stratfor was hacked. So a few months later, we start seeing that these guys from Stratfor were sending emails to each other, pretty much saying like, okay, there's this thing called trapwire, and Stratfor is trying to sell it to people, but we were seeing all these inner office emails, and it turns out that it's a surveillance system that's being sold. Or at least touted around. It was sold to a bunch of different agencies, but we started seeing that this surveillance system was being sold and given to like Washington D.C. New York PD was alleged to be using it. Texas Department of Public Safety, and like dozens. All over the world. And what the company was saying this thing was, all right, we use existing like Panda tilt cameras, like the infrastructure is already there. We're just going to combine, normal CCTV with facial recognition technology, and we're going to combine that
To
with,
identify supposedly suspicious behavior.
yeah.
Predict terror attacks.
Predict.
Yeah. So, just creepy Orwellian surveillance stuff. This was, before the Snowden revelation, stuff like that. But so, you can see here that, this is what it looks like if you go onto WikiLeaks, and you can go through the emails, and you can see guys from Stratfor telling one another, like, oh, let's try to sell this. This is awesome. We already got it here. We got it here. And this is a system that's going to make people watch them, and super creepy, whatever. A lot of it is probably hyperbole. Like, we know it's installed in places, but, it's creepy, but like, yeah, come on, it's probably not that creepy, but it might be. You never know.
They like to upsell. Stratfor likes to upsell some of their stuff.
But so my role here is, at the time I'm hanging out, I'm writing stories, and I'm researching a bunch of stuff, and I start going through these emails, and the more I see about, more from the Stratfor emails I see about trapwire, the more there's just lots and lots and lots of pieces, and that's kind of where I ended up at Project PM, because I could go online and I can hop in an IRC channel, or I can send out a tweet, or I can send, the internet's a really cool place. You can do a lot of talking with a lot of people about a lot of things.
Those are all basic crowdsourcing tools.
Yeah, and what Project PM was doing was just like open source investigating these things. Going onto Google and just typing in the right words in the right places, you can find just like really, really frightening stuff. Yeah, so like the more we started researching trapwire, the more we put these pieces of the puzzle together. where not only was Stratford trying to sell these the service, but it was really, really creepy. And this is to play off the whole tinfoil hat thing. When WikiLeaks first published the trapwire email specifically, because they were just publishing in like handfuls of times, they were DDoSed for like 2 days. Probably just a coincidence, whatever. But it was a big story. Like, this was happening. They were publishing information, evidence.
Also hiding this stuff for the companies, hiding who owns what.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So
Subsidiaries of what.
as attention focuses not just on Stratford but on Trapwire, people start going like, okay, well, who's running Trapwire? And we start going through like the chain of command of people that are involved with this, and you realize that the company that's running Trapwire is also running this company Abraxas, this company Intrepid, and they were doing pretty much everything else in like the creepy surveillance world. Like, they were actually like.
If you're familiar, if you're familiar with like Aleister Crowley, you'll recognize the name Abraxas. They have all these weird mystical names.
Yeah.
Creepy stuff. Total Analysis Corporation, Asymmetric Solutions. It sounds like stuff out of Philip K. Dick novels.
Yeah.
They would deny that they lied that they owned.
Yeah.
These things, Barrett would call them up, be like, wait.
Barrett would call them up.
Fine.
They would lie.
Yeah, people were actually going like to outside these buildings' headquarters and taking pictures because they want to know more about these things. They want, like, there's companies that are doing really creepy things and we don't know about it. Let's figure it out. Sure, we can go on Google. You go try to find the PDFs of whatever you can. It's really awesome if someone wants to go and hack something and publish 5 million emails with like a bunch of crazy evidence. I'm not advocating that because I think that could get me droned. But you want to you can do that, yeah. But so on top of this whole it's creepy, it's probably overblown, whatever. This was a couple years ago, and when it came out, there were it was picked up in the Times. It was pretty much every major newspaper in the West had a story about Trapwire, like for what's that?
Not the Atlantic.
Not the Atlantic.
Because the Center for National.
Yeah.
Center for New American.
Center for, do you want them? Do you want the mic?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the Center for New American Security guy.
Just keep going. Keep
Okay,
going.
sorry.
Okay. Yeah, we're on timing. Yeah. So anyways, super creepy, right? The point here, though, is this stuff does exist, and even if it's hyperbole, even if it is really, really overblown, just recently, Chicago, I believe around a year ago, started using facial recognition technology, the CPD, the Chicago Police Department. Last year, they actually caught someone using that facial recognition technology, and someone was just sentenced to 22 years in prison. I'm pretty sure he killed a guy or robbed a store. It's something you should be in prison probably, if you think that prisons should exist. But regardless, this stuff does exist, and we just saw last week, I believe, a police agency in the UK is now using facial recognition technology. They're using something called NeoFace, which I believe comes out of Hong Kong and is all over the East, and is all sorts of creepy stuff. So governments, agencies all over the world are using really, really creepy tools, and you can't easily get information about it. So that's where Project PM came in. That's when I started going and hanging out in chat rooms and being like, oh, has anyone seen this document? Oh, cool. Well, that brought me to this document. And then someone else will say, oh, well, that's got me that document. And then someone else will say, oh, hey, why doesn't someone go and hack something else and get all those emails? And don't necessarily do anything illegal, but when you start talking to one another and you can use the internet as this collaborative tool, it's more than just well, you realize this, you're all a bunch of nerds, but you can find some pretty interesting stuff that should be disclosed. People are spying on you, and there's no oversight there, very little oversight. And if you can find a way to elaborate on this information and bring it to the public's eye, it gets picked up. People are going to write about it. It is going to end up on the New York Times front page if it's important enough. So if you are in that infrastructure, if you're in those companies or you know someone who is, totally just leak all of that. Because
follow the Twitter handle PROJPM for Project PM and send what you find there.
Exactly.
We'll organize it and help the crowd get into it more.
So I mean, what we kind of want to do now is kind of show a demonstration of how this was all organized, how Project PM worked, how Barrett conducted his journalism and solicited volunteers to go through documents and find stuff. So We have Douglas Lucas. He's a Texas-based freelance writer, researcher, and journalist, mostly known for covering Barrett Brown's case. He has been to many of the hearings and for turning the Austin headquartered private spy firm Stratfor's emails published by WikiLeaks into national security stories at Who, What, Why, with a focus on U.S. secret involvement in and counterinsurgency approach to the Mexican drug war.
Right, so I thought that since a lot of this Project PM stuff was historical, it would be nice for us to unveil some documents that have barely been noticed before. Slide 1. Yeah, those documents. Okay, so the documents connect with both Barrett and Stratfor, and I'll tell you how and why Project PM can and should crowdsource research into them. Last week, Who at Why published my piece on frequent Mexican military aircraft and helicopter incursions into U.S. airspace. As part of our investigative partnership, WikiLeaks has added to the top of its list of Stratfor releases my Who What Why article, which was based on these intelligence products that you see right there on the screen. There are 2011 border control reports from Texas. We'll shortly show you one of them. Stratfor obtained at least 34 of them in that year. I organized them there on that page on the projector you see. So Stratfor obtained at least 34 of them, which meant they ultimately ended up at WikiLeaks. But nobody really noticed them because not many people dig into the Stratfor files. I do. So let me tell you about the documents. Slide 1. The Austin headquartered Border Security Operations Center created them. This here is a picture coming up of the Austin Center, the inside of it. As of about 2011, we're getting back to the picture, don't worry. They oversaw nearly 3,000 intelligence analysts and hundreds of live surveillance cameras around the clock. Cameras pointed at the Texas-Mexico border, which is the largest section of the U.S.-Mexico border. So obviously all this has national security implications. Just think of Obama's recent request for $3.whatever billion in emergency border funds. My next slide. This is Aaron Grigsby, then head of the Border Security Operations Center, who is one of Stratfor's sources. He's a Texas cop, specifically a Texas Ranger, which is the state police division overseeing the Austin Border Security Operations Center. I surprise interviewed him and got him to acknowledge he emailed with Stratfor VP of Intelligence, Fred Burton, the guy who says raghead all the time in the emails. Okay, so what was once Aaron Grigsby's center has 6 outlying offices called Joint Operations and Intelligence Centers. Despite being law enforcement entities, that's the name, straight out of the Pentagon glossary, militarization of police. Okay, so I found the El Paso outlying office, the El Paso Joint Operations and Intelligence Center, and surprise interviewed the border liaison officer there who did some of the forwarding of the intelligence products to Stratfor. And I surprise interviewed the Stratfor analyst who was receiving some of those El Paso office emails. I got her to acknowledge she had access to the Austin Center's intelligence products in 2011, which is when she was at Stratfor. And about the time I reminded her on the phone that the intelligent products are law enforcement sensitive and thus meant only for cop eyes only, she muttered at me, "Fuck you, motherfucker." I'll report more on that quid pro quo relationship between the El Paso office and Stratfor in a Who What Why piece to come soon that I hope Project PM can contribute to by doing additional research into these intelligence documents. So because Project PM studies the quid pro quo relationships and revolving doors between government security entities and private security intelligence contractors, really control is a better word than security because as Thomas Drake said yesterday, all this surveillance is ultimately about population control, taking away our individual sovereignty. And these documents have personal data about us, and it gets sprayed out of places like that El Paso office's Texas DPS email address to private spies like Stratfor, possibly in violation of the law, and thankfully WikiLeaks gets a hold of them. Okay, so let me tell you now a little bit about the documents. First one, page 1. Yeah, okay. So these are called Border Operations Sector Assessments, or BOSAs for short. Stratfor obtained at least 34 of them. Where am I? You'll know the first page of it, you can see the Texas flag there because it's created under the auspices of the Texas State Police, namely the Rangers, that Aaron Grigsby guy, but it's actually military contractors who were creating these. It was Abrams, Learning and Information Systems, fuck you, motherfucker. That's what I refer to her as short. In 2010, she was creating these. She told me so. I'm kind of tricky when I interview people. And then she later moved to Stratford a year later and started receiving a bunch of them from the El Paso office. So you'll note the document on page 1 is marked controlled unclassified information. It's elsewhere marked as law enforcement sensitive. Now page 78. Right. So this is the slide for Anonymous versus Los Zetas. The caption says, quote, mask worn by anonymous members and supporters, known as the Guy Fawkes mask, unquote. Ain't that cute? Slide's first 2 sentences, quote, it appears that the online hacker collective Anonymous has decided to take on Mexico's most violent drug cartel, Los Zetas. Speculation about the scope of the conflict abounds, fueled by several conflicting reports about the hacktivist group's intentions, unquote. Then the slide details the conflicting reports. You can see why this stuff leads to the Department of Justice saying in Barrett Brown's case that Anonymous is trying to overthrow the government, because you have these understaffed, under-resourced, complete idiot intelligence analysts doing stuff like this, and it gets funneled up to the higher level people, ultimately like DOJ. Haven't proved that entirely, but that's the basic gist of how it works. Okay, so indeed, Texas Border Control Intelligence was monitoring Op Cartel, which was primarily a creation of Anons in Mexico. Barrett was involved in that operation. As Op Cartel was underway, ex-military contractors associated with Tom Ryan posted Barrett's street address online. They stated the address was, quote, for the Zetas so they can have the right Barrett Brown address, unquote. The Zetas were initially Mexican special forces who had been trained with U.S. funds. Brown fled here to New York City and was mocked by the mainstream media for all of it. But note that today, also largely ignored by the U.S. mainstream media, autodefensists, self-defense groups, have sprung up in Mexico for good or ill to fight back against the narcos. So those are sort of decentralized groups, just as crowdsourcing research is decentralized. Whatever the drawbacks of Op Cartel and the autodefenses, Barrett was ahead of his time as usual. People mocked him. When he was first raided in 2012, the FBI lead agent on his case, none other than the aptly named Agent Smith, did not publicize the warrant and affidavit, claiming the Bureau wanted to protect Brown from the Zetas. So the secrecy made that first raid on Barrett harder to prove. People didn't believe Barrett. So these documents will be for great justice when we research them. Now I'll show you what some of the BOSAs typically contain. Page 2, please. Okay. See here a key event and finding, quote, the largest single marijuana seizure occurred in the Rio Grande Valley sector where U.S. Border Patrol agents seized 132 bundles of marijuana totaling 3,262.05 pounds concealed within a load of produce from a 1999 Kentworth truck, unquote. So the Rio Grande Valley is where one of those Joint Operations and Intelligence Center outlying offices is. Now page 47, it says, has the details. So let's look at page 47 because this is how you would crowdsource research into it if you want to help Project PM, which everybody can do. So here we see that the weed, not weave, but weed, the pot, was, quote, commingled in a load of produce, unquote, and, importantly, that the incident happened at the Falfurrias Border Patrol checkpoint. We know the document is reporting between October 26 and November 2, so now we can send a Freedom of Information Act request to Customs and Border Protection for this very incident. Hell, for all incidents and all 34 of the intelligent products, ultimately we can all organize them and put them on Project PM. They're not going to like that, but we will. Then, last thing, Stratford also obtained daily and weekly products from the 6 outlying offices. So once we organize those, we can drill down to an even more granular level of the history of 2011 National Security Border Control from the point of view of the spies. These other data in the BOSAs, they have statistics on kidnapping of migrants, quote unquote, apprehension of illegal immigrants, data on cartel movements, data on the hunt for mythical terrorists supposedly crossing the border, and much more, including tons of pictures. Grinning Texas cops in cowboy hats photographed next to trucks with drugs they seized. Finally, let me show you the last thing that we've organized so far at the Project PM website. One sec. You'll note that the title of it is 2011 Texas Border Security Intelligence Products. So far, we've only organized the Border Operations Sector Assessments, the BOSAs. You know, the one that we found a smoking gun between the border liaison officer Lloyd Shook at the El Paso office, sending one of these BOSAs to Victoria J. Allen, aka fuck you, motherfucker. So yeah, 2011 Texas Border Security Intelligence Products, the one we've organized so far, the 34 BOSAs, and we're going to continue organizing the daily and weekly reports, and we'll have a whole map, a whole history of 2011 border control in Texas, and we can do that with photographs, we can make maps, we can make visualizations. And you'll note here the intelligence products, we got the dates, so it's set up like a calendar. We've got the dates that the reports cover, the direct links to the intelligence products at WikiLeaks Press, thanks for that, WikiLeaks Press, or the bin links at WikiLeaks, and the link to the Stratfor email at the WikiLeaks website where the product was attached. So finally, now you have the organization that you need to begin researching these products on your own, all of us together. There's something, 80 pages times 34 documents. There's going to be enough to go around for everybody until the end of time. Read them, Google what you find, send FOIA requests, surprise interview people, they'll say fun things. We can do, and then just tweet your findings to me at Douglas Lucas or to Project PM at PROJPM. That way we can better understand the public-private intelligence complex, which is ruining so much, including Barrett Brown.
And I do recommend Douglas's latest article because it talks about Mexican military incursions over the border that are apparently, according to Stratfor, happening regularly.
Yeah, last month's Arizona incursion, where a Mexican police helicopter flew into Arizona airspace and shot near U.S. Border Patrol agents, is no fluke. These intelligence products, these BOSAs, show examples of Mexican military helicopters doing this sort of stuff frequently. And that's just one thing. Helicopters, okay, so let's find, what are we going to find next? Let's find Zeta cartel members crossing the bridges. They do that.
But what was the comment of the head Stratfor exec when asked about this?
Oh, yeah. That was Fred Burton, again, the guy who says raghead all the time. He was, yeah, he does. He's a one-of-a-kind character. You couldn't invent him for a novel unless you were Philip K. Dick. So what he said about these helicopter incursions is that they happen all the time. And don't tell Alex Jones or Glenn Beck because people will freak out once they realize what I found, which is that Mexican military aircraft are crossing the border all the time. I actually combined my Stratfor research with the Freedom of Information Act request that showed Mexican military aircraft entered something like 94 times between 2010 and 2012, entered U.S. airspace, and you can find all of that on whowhatwhy.com or at the wikileaks.org/GI files list of releases. It's at the very top due to our investigative partnership.
Excellent. And so our last speaker we're going to hear from, and I'm not sure if there will be time for questions, is Lauren Pespiza. She works with Transparency Toolkit, and she's kind of working on tools that can improve crowdsourcing, improve the analysis of large data sets and the visualization of these things and so on. So tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I was in Project PM during like 2011. Oh, okay. So I was in Project PM around all this time, all this stuff was happening, and I was seeing how it was, in a way, somewhat tedious to go through all these emails and documents, and we were all doing it sort of by hand. And yeah, you had search on WikiLeaks, you search for keywords and stuff, but there really wasn't too much, analytics software that we could use to put all this stuff together real fast. So it made it sort of a sort of small group of really interested people that were hashing out about it to begin with. Like making fun of NSA contractors and embarrassing them is just something that is one of my favorite pastimes. So, and especially with a lot of other people in Project PM felt that way too. And it was. So you got more? Okay. It was fun.
Transfer to a quit up there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't want to go too far into it because we need to have like an actual release and stuff. But this is sort of what we've been working on. What I've been working on with my founder Shadash for the past 6 months or so, and he's been working on it longer. And it's a data analytics platform that connects to a lot of different data sets like OpenGov stuff, Sunlight Foundation, WikiLeaks, and will enable people to sort of visualize stuff better. There's timeline tools and table generation. You can chain tools together to make even more interesting comparisons to network graph. Actually, what? Yeah, more. It's just more effective. It's what this is what like most startups do now is like analytic stuff. It's pretty. If we had had this when Project PM was going on, we would have been releasing 3 times the amount of like discoveries, and it would have been a lot more. Maybe Bear would have gotten a lot more credit because I know that when before Snowden's leaks came out or revelations came out, Barrett was sort of still sort of treated like a conspiracy theorist, like. All those weird people at Project PM finding this stuff. Like this was stuff published by major media organizations, but people still didn't really take Barrett seriously. And then we were really vindicated when Edward Snowden came forward with all the revelations about the surveillance technology. Like, oh yeah, we told you. We've known this for a long time, guys. But,
Absolutely right. And
yeah.
So, what is this, Lauren?
Oh yeah, that's our network graph of the NSA contractors on LinkedIn. We scraped LinkedIn searching for all the acronyms and of secret programs that like PRISM and stuff like that, and found that most of them, a lot of these contractors post their secret programs they're working on to their public LinkedIn profile. So we can easily generate a network graph to show like the connections and how big these programs are and how many people work on them. And it's kind of embarrassing to them, which is always fun.
I did see once, actually a couple of cops on LinkedIn decide to put like, I'm an expert in network exploitation, which of course it's shown to everybody on the internet, and then later he's hacked and like run out of the entire state, and he has no idea why. And it's like, well, if you put on your LinkedIn that you're a cop and you're exploiting people's computers, it's gonna like the whole world is gonna come at you.
Oh, like Aaron Barr?
Yeah. No, it's a different guy. I forget his name, but this was a case I saw. But
So I think we've illustrated quite aptly why this Project PM thing in the wiki was viewed as a threat to the FBI and the powers that be. I think we have time for just one question. And there's a microphone just right over there, I believe.
Two questions if you run really fast up there.
I just want to ask if there's some place that all of this is going to be easily comprehended and published anytime soon. Do you have any plan to do that?
Well, so there is the Project PM Wiki, which you can still visit. However, some of its information is outdated because the founder has been in jail and it hasn't been so active. But I've written a few articles where you can catch up on what all this work was. My name is Kevin Gallagher. Just look, I have a couple on Huffington Post. There's one on Daily Dot that just covers the issues that Project PM was into, and particularly the private intelligence contractors.
You can also help.
Yeah.
You can also help us coordinate. You can also help yourself. Anyone can help.
This is the whole point.
It doesn't have to be all pretty and nice. You can like directly do this yourself too. You can jump in and join Project PM. It spreads the legal liability around. Then you can check out my Who What Why latest report this week. It's my pinned tweet, and you can check out the forthcoming one I'm going to have. And I'll get that fuck you motherfucker transcript out one way or another.
Hey guys, I posted this question to Snowden before on Twitter, but apparently
Did he answer you?
No, I mean there was no answering from, no questioning him at all. But I want to ask this to you, Andrew, actually, particularly. How do you guys as well feel about your activist work against one civilian state and against one repressive call it state is used to whitewash the reputation of another actively military aggressive state? I'm talking about your work with RT. I'm talking about Snowden's work with on other Russian media, and just want to hear your opinion about it.
I just think that everything that's happening, I don't like secrets, and if you're doing anything to anyone, anywhere, in any part of the world, other people should know. Everyone, everywhere, especially the bad things, like it's...
The problem is that, for example, on RT, being one of the main voices of Russia to the rest of the world right now, your credible and substantial, interesting work is put next to the blatant lies and blatant Russian propaganda.
He's the most credible person at the network.
It's all just different jurisdictions. There's a Russia jurisdiction, there's an Al Jazeera English jurisdiction. You can publish stuff wherever. I'm a freelancer. Work with whatever jurisdiction is going to get your info out.
I say, guys, your work is used to whitewash the reputation of Russia's aggression.
Okay.
How do you feel about it?
All right. Can we go to the next question?
You can talk to me about that when I'm not on stage. with
Everybody in the
live stream on
world,
internet forever.
everybody in the world can read websites from any jurisdiction. So it's a global audience.
Barrett was a big proponent of going after, in particular, what Russia's been doing. The
Absolutely.
fact that he's in jail right now and not here on this stage, like, just trashing Vladimir Putin is an absolute travesty. And we'd like him back, like, now. Him and Jeremy, too. And Wormer and Kahuna
PayPal 14,
and
all the other political
and
prisoners.
PayPal 14.
Our political prisoners.
You know, if you guys, if we
Chelsea Manning.
want to fight this menace, but when our government is locking up our own hackers and our own best and brightest people, it's just like it's a heresy. So I do like our research doesn't. I would like to think it does not help whitewash Russia's abuses. 'Cause
Next question, yeah.
we know we know what they're doing.
We're over time,
Last
so
one,
please
last
keep
one.
it quick.
All right, just to be brief, we've just heard from Edward Snowden, and the revelations that he revealed is that we're being spied on, right? But what you're talking about is a relentless campaign of cyber warfare, essentially, some of it against U.S. citizens. How does it make you feel that the narrative currently in the media surrounding cyber warfare and this stuff is about we are being spied on, something that many of us have sort of known for a while, whereas what you're talking about is essentially domestic cyber warfare?
Yeah, we need to look at the state and local levels. We need to look at the private security contractors that work within the U.S., often on the state and local levels, sometimes on the national levels. It's not just the U.S. intelligence community's 16 agencies, it's also state police departments, stuff like that, that get ignored in favor of the global coverage.
One last thing. All of the emails I've read at Stratfor, I think, would be put together nicely as a very dark sitcom, like a True Detective or American Dad, except like really racist.
Go for it.
Bo Wilmon, let's make that happen.
Thank you, everyone.
Permission?
One more? You want to give one more?
All right, you guys were talking about how. All right, I got it. Hello.
Good evening, Hope. Okay, we're just slightly delayed, but while we're getting things together up here, I have a couple of very brief announcements to make. If you like what this guy's doing and you're into other forms of electronic music, there's a chiptune concert going on downstairs at 10 p.m. down by the behind the escalator to the mezzanine. And if you were there last night, you know how insane and wonderful it was. If you weren't there, this is your last chance to make up for that. So check that out. As you all should know, but I'm going to announce it anyway, all the talks were pushed forward an hour, so you're watching now a talk that was scheduled on your programs and on the posters to start an hour ago. And also, as a result, the Time Travel for Dummies panel is pushed forward to 3 p.m. yesterday. It's going to have been wonderful. Okay, we're gonna do a little more setting up here and then get started.
Yeah, if this makes sound, we're ready to go. So, is the sound running? Am I making sound yet? I'm not sure. No, wait. Yeah, let me see if I'm up here. Oh, maybe not. I'm making sound. Oh. Should that be making sound? There we go. Okay. Now is it making sound out there? The purple cable? This guy? How about now?
Got it.
It is not very loud. Nothing coming out? Okay, all right, no problem. I don't want to make us listen to the laptop speaker. Maybe it's not going all the way in. Oh, I have a tiny headphone jack. Nothing? Is it going that way?
Can you put it through and test it?
That should be buzzing.